Good to see all of you this evening. We're in the book of Ezekiel. We've been studying this book for quite some time and actually going to cover a couple chapters tonight, cover a couple chapters, Lord willing, next Wednesday, and then we're going to take a breath from it. We're going to step away from Ezekiel for a little while, do something different. What that different is, I don't know yet. I've got a couple of two different ideas in my head. I just can't settle on one, but I'll let you know next week what we're going to start doing the next week after that. But in the meantime, we want to cover a few chapters yet. Try to hit the halfway point in a relationship to the book of Ezekiel in this process. And we've been using this kind of survey approach to kind of help in some ways expedite it and so we don't get kind of caught up in the details so much that we miss the message. We've been kind of using a much more broader approach in the last several weeks in relationship to this study. And so hopefully that'll be beneficial for us throughout our study this evening. I actually want to back you up to chapter 20 because I think there's a little portion at the very end of chapter 20 that sets the stage for chapter 21 that I think we need to take a quick look at that I didn't get to last week. So chapter 20, and in verses 45 through 49, through the end of that text, there's a couple of different things that we notice in the very end there where he talks about, he tells Ezekiel to drop thy word and prophecy. I apologize for this in some ways, but it's interesting. All I could think about was Ezekiel holding a mic and saying his prophecy and dropping it in front. But that's the imagery. That is the imagery. It's like just tell them and be done. Tell them what the message is. There's no wavering from it. There's no debating it. There's no trying to barter or change it. It is the judgment of God. Drop that message to them and be done, because God isn't wavering or turning from it in any form or fashion. He tells them in that moment that there's a fire that's coming in that imagery that will devour both green and dry. What do you think he means by that? A fire that will... Go ahead, I'm sorry. Okay. There's a totality as it relates to that. Young and old, okay? I think maybe that could be seen when you think about a green tree, it's usually young, and if it's dry, it's usually older. The imagery might, if you fast forward into chapter 21, also have reflection on what two classifications of people? Right, and the wicked, right? The righteous and the wicked. That's the way it's going to be described when you get over into the next chapter. He's going to talk about the righteous and the wicked. And so I think he uses this imagery and again, remember, Ezekiel didn't write Ezekiel chapter 20, ... right? It's not how he wrote it. He just wrote it, and then men came along later and segmented it so it's easier to find. But here's this message that goes forth initially in this kind of parable form of how it would be a fire that would devour both green and dry. In chapter 21, what's the weapon, if you will? It's a sword, right? So in chapter 21, we're going to switch to a sword. Same conversation, just different imagery as it relates to those things. And he said at the end of that context of chapter 20 that what would happen to that fire? Yeah, that fire will not be quenched. As they appreciate that sentiment. And then towards the end again, we learn that everyone, as a result of that, will know what? Yeah, that I am the Lord. That's a phrase that comes up over and over and over again within the narrative. They will know then that I am the Lord who has kindled the fire, and the inability to quench it is actually evidence to what? Of who lit it, right? If other issues that might have come up in relationship to them, there may have been circumstances where they were able to address challenges and problems that would have come. Maybe a fire from this nation would have arrived and they would have been able to quench that. Or here was a situation from another nation or problem and they were able to resolve that. But this fire is all-consuming. And it is so powerful that at the end result of it, they will absolutely know that God is Lord and you can't quench a fire He decides to set and leave unquenched. And that's the imagery that leads us then into chapter 21. So let's look at that. As Ezekiel responded to God, I forgot, let me throw this back. One more verse, sorry. That Ezekiel has an interesting moment, and I want to make sure we point this out in verse 49. Do we have very many occasions where you see Ezekiel having a conversation back? Not necessarily, right? You get the message, you hear God, here's what God is telling Ezekiel to say or do, but you don't have a lot of moments where Ezekiel has conversations back. But here he does. And what's he say in verse 49? Okay, so the people, right, the people are kind of mocking Ezekiel, right? Because God tells him the word of the Lord, and Ezekiel goes and tells the people the word of the Lord, and they're not responding. They're not reacting in the ways that God would desire for them to react. And they even claim he's just talking in parables. What kind of profoundness should there be if he's just speaking in these parables, these stories? He keeps doing all these kind of metaphors and all this symbolism and all these things. And so he has become concerned that his message is falling on deaf ears because they've just kind of labeled it all as parable and not worth really their time and energy to appreciate. And so now under that backdrop, go to chapter 21 and appreciate what Ezekiel now was told by Jehovah in maybe clearer senses. Fire, green, dry, parable. Okay, you want it clear? Go tell them a sword's coming. They'll understand that. Go tell them about the sword of the Lord that's going to come and the challenges that will bring to them. There's that word again. Drop thy word towards where? Jerusalem. And what else? What other phrase is there? Yeah, prophesy towards those holy places. Take this message directly to the heart of the people. Take this message specifically right into the heart of the people and let them know that I'm not just talking to a pocket. I'm talking from the leadership where? On down. From the high places, the holy places, to the priests, to the princes, to the prophets. I'm starting at the top and I'm working all the way down with the challenges that they have been experiencing through these particular situations. And he talks about then this sword of judgment in verses 3 and 4 that are going to come. And unfortunately, who's going to get caught up in that? Yeah, everybody's going to get caught up in it. Now, there's an interesting nuance I hope we get to tonight as it relates to the dross in chapter 22 and how God can use fire to kind of distinguish and separate what's precious and what isn't. That's coming in the conversation. So don't become overwhelmed with the idea initially here that, oh no, nobody gets out of this spared. That's not really the message exactly, because he's going to talk about that a little bit later on. But initially here, he wants this powerful imagery to go out that everybody gets caught up in this. And even though there's some that are innocent, even though there are some that aren't responsible for this judgment that is coming, when you bring consequence to an entire nation of people, everybody gets caught up in it. And even those who have some levels of innocence are going to get caught up in that situation as well. He mentions 1 Peter chapter, and by the way, when I say he, I'm talking about those worksheets if you were still working through those, and those are dealing with questions 3 and 4 of those question sheets if you're still using them. But I did want to look at 1 Peter 4 and verse 18 for a minute, because it's similar. It's not exactly the same, right? It's not exactly the same, but it is similar kinds of language here in 1 Peter chapter 4 and in verse 18, where the writer Peter said this. He said, "Now, if the righteous one is scarcely saved, where will the ungodly and the sinner appear?" So there's this imagery in Ezekiel about this challenge that's coming, and when it comes, everybody gets caught up in the wake of it. And Peter tries to also recognize that, if the righteous, struggle to find that salvation, and it doesn't come easily, and there's effort and work that has to be put forth, then where does that leave everybody else? And in some senses, maybe there's some similarities there. If God's willing to bring this judgment and the righteous and the wicked are affected by it, then their situation must be pretty sobering, that God would have to do it in that fashion. In verses 5 through 7, again, that imagery. Know that I am the Lord as a result of this. Know that I am the one who's bringing this. And then he makes this interesting picture. He says, sigh to the point of what? Just completely falling down, he says. If you go back into that text, he basically can you imagine just taking in such a despairing sigh over the condition of the people that you would just collapse at the thought of those challenges. And you might say, well, why? Why was it so difficult? Why was it so challenging? And then he describes it there at the very end. He says, because their hearts will melt, their hands are feeble, their spirits faint, and their knees are like what? I didn't put it. They're like water. Now, some of you may some days feel like your knees are like water. And so maybe you understand a little bit what he's trying to drive at there, right? There is a weakness, he said, that will overwhelm them. And when they begin to realize that there's no resisting this judgment that God is bringing, their hearts will, when they see this sword approaching, when they see this fire coming that can't be quenched, when they recognize that what they have been saying all this time can't happen, won't happen, shouldn't happen, when they see it come, they will have weakened hands, feeble hands, knees that can't hold them up. They will see the consequences of their choices and behaviors in ways that they never thought could have occurred. I'll pause. Anything out of the first 7 verses there? Mm-hmm.
From south to the north. We're originally talking in the first part there about Jerusalem. Is this referring to all of Israel, north and south to the north, or what is that referring to?
I think he just has the idea that every direction. The Babylon's coming from the north, and so they're coming from north to south, but they've got to come. We'll see it in a little bit when he talks about that forked road, that crossroads where he can deal with Ammon, or he can go over here and deal with Judah, and Ezekiel's going to have to tell him, no, you're going to go to both. But I think he's just giving an imagery of all of it. It's all consuming. And actually, in some senses, they will. If you think about Judah, Babylon can come down and then have to work their way back up through the nation. So you might see it from a literal. I didn't really see a literal there. What I'm seeing there is just this imagery that all of it gets covered. It's all covered. I didn't know that there was any. I don't know of anything specific that he might be referencing there. There could be something I'm just missing.
I just wondered if it was just talking that he was including all the holy nation of Israel.
Yes.
That was what I was curious about.
Yeah, and I think that is the imagery that he's just, because Judah, Israel's already been taken away. Judah's the only thing left, and it's a little bit confusing because he keeps using the word Israel, right, within the narrative. He keeps saying, but he's referencing the only part that's left of all of Israel, which is Judah. And so he'd have to come down past, down to the bottom to Judah and could work their way back up.
When he was speaking in 20 there, looking to the south, he was referring to Jerusalem, right?
Yeah, you're talking about verse 20 of which chapter?
I don't know. You had 46 through 49.
Oh, you're talking about the very end of chapter 20. Okay. So you're talking about 20 and 20? Because I didn't address. Right? Okay. I'm just trying to find which verse you're asking me about. Okay. Yeah, I know that text. I'm not sure what the question is as it relates to it.
I'm asking is, when he's telling him to look to the south, when he says to the south, is he referring to Jerusalem?
Oh, okay, I got you. And I mean, that seems to be the emphasis, because he's talking about the message going directly to those in charge, the holy places. So I think that's most likely his intent, is to point that message right at Jerusalem, right? Because that's where everything's flowing out of. That's where all the challenges are. So yes, and I apologize for getting that a little scrambled as far as what was being asked. But yes, I think it is very specifically to them, and it's going to encompass all of the nation. Go ahead, Jim.
Is he saying that there's nothing you can do now to change the outcome?
Well, and he's been saying that. The whole prophecy is telling them that there's no turning from this. The judgment's going to come, they'll have the consequences, and then God will have a remnant, and he'll restore them, which we know historically happens. But no, I think that repeated message, the fire's not quenched, and those kinds of imageries are throughout. Appreciate the questions. Back to chapter 21 then, in verses 8 through 11, it's interesting because he says this sword has been what? Okay, sharpened, and what else? Polished, and there's another, and what else is occurring in that narrative? I feel like there's another word there, and let's go back and
also furbished.
there, okay, and furbished. So, and that idea of making sure that they understand that everything has been made ready to fulfill this purpose that God has for them. It's not a time for mirth, not a time to take this lightly, but this sword has been prepared, sharpened, readied, furbished, so that he can hand it to the one who will wield it. They shouldn't have any doubts in their minds that God can accomplish this. I've prepared the weapon, if you will. I've made it ready. I've prepared it. Its intended purpose is set. I'm going to make the weapon, and then I'm going to walk up to Babylon and say, here, take this and go do the job that needs to be done. All things that need to be taken care of in order that this judgment can be brought are going to be fulfilled. They're not going to escape it. The one who's going to wield it is prepared. Everything's ready for this judgment to occur. Keep moving through. He says when they realize it's not something to have mirth about, not something to joke about, but it's something to cry over and to howl over in verses 12 and 13. It's a trial. And it's a trial for everybody. You know, it again is going to affect both the righteous and the wicked. And, you know, you think about that. What would the temptation be if you've been part of this remnant who's tried not to follow the poor leadership of the nation? You've tried your best to stay faithful to the Lord, and you're caught up in this just like everybody else. What would the temptation be? To blame God, to remove your integrity of faith, to quit, to say, why should I keep going if I'm going to suffer the same kinds of challenges? And all I'm trying to illustrate to us is that trial is coming in every direction. It's a trial against those who have perpetrated wickedness and evil against God. It's going to try the faithful. Everything that's going to happen is going to be a trial towards those who have brought it. And he said, interestingly, at the end of this, verse 13, that if the rod tries to rise up against the sword, the rod will what? Yeah, the rod will lose, okay? I believe he's talking about the rod being the last of those kings, right? Zedekiah is the last of those kings that in each one we're going to see a sword times 3 here in a minute before we're done in this narrative. But there were those last kind of 3 kings, and each one had an opportunity just sit still, right? Just sit here and let God take care of things like He intends to. Don't resist the Babylonians. They're God's choice. Don't and do anything to try to change this, and we'll get through it. And each one tried to fight and resist. They'd make leagues and try to trust Egypt or whatever. And so even if the rod, Zedekiah, the last of those kings, rises up, the sword will destroy it. They're not going to find a way to escape these things. The rod will lose. And ultimately, he does. In verses 14 through 17 is where we see that. He talks about double the sword how many times? 3 times, right? Or thrice. He tells them that they need to appreciate that there were 3 entities that God had to deal with as it relates to bringing these judgments against the people. Jehoiakim, Jogoniah, and then ultimately Zedekiah. I think that's what he's referencing there. That the sword times 3. Here's this effort to try to remove one king, see if we can make it work. Nope, that didn't work. Put another one in. Nope, that didn't work. Put another one. Nope, that didn't work. And ultimately, this complete consequential judgment has to come because of that. And there's an interesting reference, by the way, towards the end of that. He said great soldiers, great men, had to die because these 3 guys wouldn't behave themselves. If these 3 leaders, again, had held their peace, not tried to resist and fight, just accepted the lot and purpose that God had established when He brought the Babylonians in, we could have saved a lot of bloodshed. I think that's what he's referencing there. He said there were great men that perished because these 3 guys kept resisting God's purpose, which meant every time they did, what did the Babylonians do? Come on down, fight again, kill some more, take more into captivity. Take more in it, right? Every time they created greater problems. And so he says there were a lot of great men who suffered. A lot of great men who suffered consequence because it took 3 swords, if you will, 3 times for him to finally just completely go in and bring consequence over the people. I'll pause for a moment. Anything out of that section that I've missed?
In 13, right, it's talking about, okay, the sword is battle, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, the sword is God's weapon that He handed to Babylon. Yes.
Is the ruler of Judah, right? Now, in Genesis 49, it says the scepter will not depart. Now, is this saying here in 13 that the sword despises the scepter and doesn't want it to continue? I'm not really following that too good there.
Well, and I think in verse 13, he's talking about, some translations use the word scepter. That's the rod. In the King James uses the rod. And I think what he's saying is, because it is a trial or a testing, what happens if the sword doesn't like the scepter, the rule, right? The rod. The rod loses. The rod shall be no more. So the sword has power over the rod. The ruling power, the scepter in Judah, is not going to be able to resist and overcome what God does with the sword of Babylon. That's what I see.
The verse in Genesis 49 and 10, it says that the scepter is the rule of God, shall not depart from Judah.
And
Verse 13 here in Ezekiel that we're looking at, isn't that it's a reference to a specific scepter, if you will? The specific king at that time, not in the
Yeah, and
sense of a rule over Judah.
I don't know that those are parallel. I don't believe Genesis 49 and what's happening here are parallel. I think they have two different contexts, two different things in mind. And there's a whole different kind of situation happening in Genesis 49, I believe, as it relates to these three rulers and what's happening. Because, I think it's all part of that whole idea that they had convinced themselves that their rulers would get them out of this. Their prophets will get them out of this. Their priests will get them out of this. There's this constant thought process among the people that we'll find a way. We're not going to have to suffer all these things. And I think the imagery to me is when the sword arrives and it despises the scepter, the rule, the sword's going to win. And that's what I believe he's trying to show in this narrative, in this specific situation that he's addressing. I'm just telling you what I see. Thoughts or question?
Could it be that the sword, Babylon, despised the scepter or the rule because Jehoahaz was the last in the lineage to be a true lineage king? So
Yeah.
they can despise that.
Right. Because they kept establishing kings that weren't necessarily part of the royal heritage. And so that could, yes, I would agree that that's a potential possibility of description here, that's the manner in which they would have despised. I think that's probable. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Okay, so Babylon eventually, the text says, is going to reach a crossroads. And they're going to have a decision to have to make. And what's interesting is the text tells us, and we're in verses 18 through 20 of chapter 21, that they can go deal with Raboth or Riblah, depending on which way you want to say it, among the Ammonites, or they can head down into Judah and deal with them. And it kind of reminds us that though Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon is being used by Jehovah for his purposes, they're just kind of still a conquering nation that's out there fighting whomever they decide that they want to try to conquer. You know what I mean? They're still a human nation that's got these battles in various places and this spreading of their kingdom around, and they're having to make decisions. Where can I send resources? Can I fight two battles at the same time? Can I take on the Ammonites and those in Judah at the same time? They're trying to make those kind of warfare decisions, and they've come to a point where they've got to decide. Do we go down towards the Ammonites, or do we go towards Judah? What do we do in this moment? And so, as many of them did, he decides, well, we're going to use some divination in order to try to get there. And by that, it simply means they're trying to use some kind of sorcery, if you will, some measure of chance and luck to try to figure out which of these ways should we go. And so the text tells us that he uses arrows, idols, and livers in order to try to decide. Now, I can kind of get the first two easily, right? You kind of get this idea of if maybe you take 3 arrows and you'd launch them, and they would tell you which direction or should you go any of them, and so you might use that. You launch them, and if they hit a certain target, you might do it that way. Right, exactly. Which one hits? You might try to pray to some idol and see if they can give you some kind of information or knowledge. The liver thing, as I understand it, was sometimes if you'd made a sacrifice to an idol and you asked that idol for something when you made that sacrifice, if you cut out the liver and the liver was basically diseased, then that would tell you, oh, that's a false divination. So whatever the idol said to me, it can't be trusted because the liver was diseased. And that was something apparently that they did, a manner in which they could try to determine whether the messaging was true or not. It's not right. It's all craziness to us. I get that. But that was what they were doing. He's trying to figure out which way should I go, and that was the technique that he was using. And ultimately, that fell on Jerusalem. But if you keep reading in that narrative, Judah didn't believe it. They didn't believe it. They believed that was the false divination. Arrow hits the target that was meant for Jerusalem. Uh-oh, we're coming. When they're told that prophecy, they don't believe it. They're still in denial that any of these things could happen unto them. And part of the reason why they're thinking that way is they'd made oaths both to Egypt and to the Ammonites as to how if they needed help, who they would turn to in order to resolve that. But God tells them, your transgressions are coming against you. You're not escaping this. You can turn to whatever league or whatever relationship or whatever connectivity you wanted to make as it relates to it all day long, and it won't happen. That day of reckoning for the prince had come. And that judgment was coming. And it's interesting analogy there. He says the royal diadem was removed and would be held for its rightful heir. And who's that? That's Jesus. That's Jesus. Right? That diadem, that recognition of royalty is going to be removed from that king. Did they have any kings after that? No. Even after their return. That day is over. That diadem, that royalty, that kingship has been taken away from them and would just be held. It's one of the moments where Ezekiel actually points us towards the coming of the Messiah. Jesus is coming to them. But that diadem would be removed and then held for the rightful heir that was to come. But would the Ammonites get away for all the things they had done? No. The end of the chapter talks about that. The Ammonites are going to suffer the same judgment of God that Judah had as well. They would face God's judgment. The sword would come to them as well. And I think your question sheets, again, if you're looking at those still at question 8, ask you, well, where is all that happening? For those at home, you'll never be able to see what I'm doing, but you'll have to take my word for it. I'm walking up here, and I'm pointing to a map. You can hear me say it, but you can't see me do it. But basically, Babylon to the north, right? Babylon to the north. Here's Ammon, okay? Here's the Dead Sea, Jordan River. Here's the So here's Ammon. Judah's down here. So you can imagine, you're coming from Babylon, you get down in here, and you got to decide, am I coming this side and going to come down into Judah, or am I going to stay on this side and come down here into Ammon? Who gets my attention? And ultimately, God says, they both do. You're going to both. You're going to deal with both of those nations of people because I'm bringing my judgment against both of those nations of people. And so the responsibilities that Babylon had to fulfill God's purposes are really immense in a lot of ways. Questions, thoughts about chapter 21? I know I'm flying a little bit tonight, but hopefully we're getting the big picture, which is really what I want to do. All right, so chapter 22, two basic sections. He tells them to judge that bloody city, is what he calls them in the very beginning of the chapter. And he tells them, you show them their abominations. You go and let them know exactly what they had done that caused this consequence and judgment to come. He tells them that they had made idols against themselves to defile themselves. They were doing things that they thought were there to their benefit, and they were actually creating more difficulties for themselves along the way. And they made themselves a mockery, the text says in verses 4 and 5. They'd made themselves a mockery to the nations around them. They'd had this God that was blessing them and helping them, and they turned to idols that weren't doing anything for them. And you can almost hear the laughter of the nations round about them say, look what they had and look what they gave up because they followed these other things. In verses 6 through 12, he just tells them what it was. They had shed blood. They had dealt poorly with parents, with strangers, with orphans, with widows. He said they had despised the holy things and profaned the Sabbath. That actually came from the priesthood that was doing those things. He said they were slanderous. They were willing to lie against one another. He said they were lewd. He said there was, I'm not even going to read that list, every type of fornication that you could imagine, they were guilty of. That's how pitiful their sinful behaviors had come. And he's pretty specific about the kinds of things that they had experienced. They'd bribed murderers, willing to pay for somebody to go take somebody else's life, he said. They'd extorted their neighbors. Didn't bother them a bit to extort their neighbors. And ultimately, at the conclusion of that, he said they forgot the Lord. That's a pretty sobering list. That's a pretty sorrowful list of things that they had been committing that finally God says enough's enough, judgment has to come. And then at the end of the chapter, we're told that God smites his hand at their dishonesty. Their heart would not endure the challenges and conflicts. Their hand would not be strong enough to withstand. These are imageries we've already seen. And he said he would scatter them and consume their filthiness. It's a pretty sad description of the people who should have been God's people. A people that knew better, and the difficulties they brought to themselves because of their decision making. They had inherited the consequences that they had sown themselves to. They had become dross. And there was a question in your lesson sheets that we gave out some time ago about that. And that's basically, in the short version here in the last 30 seconds, that's basically impure metals, right? Metals that weren't of particular value. And sometimes you'd have to heat them all together in order to get them to separate so that you would know the difference between what was pure and good and beneficial and what was the dross, the materials and metals that weren't any good. God said, I'm going to bring a fire, and it's going to melt all the metals together, and it's going to let me see who's purified on the one side and where the dross is. That's how he pictured them in that situation, these base metals that would have to be heated to be separated. They were uncleansed in the land. Their prophets were conspirators, devouring what they could like a lion. Their priests had violated the law and profaned that which was holy. The princes were like wolves, seeking dishonest gain. The prophets used poor mortar to put things back together. The people then followed all that. That poor leadership, and God looked ultimately for one who would stand in the gap, but he couldn't find one. Who will stand in the gap and defend God's people? And among those leaders, among those priests, among all those folks that should have been stepping in that gap, he couldn't find one. And so ultimately, that consequence would come. All right, so thank you for your patience. I need to finish. I got to finish. And so I got to keep moving. I can't stop. I got to keep moving. And it's because I want to finish the first half of the book, Lord willing, next Wednesday. So again, if you've got questions that I didn't cover, things you saw that I didn't cover, feel free to come ask me. But I just felt like I need to push through here over the next couple of weeks so we can finish up this first half of this book. And then we'll come back. So Lord willing, we'll come back next Wednesday and do probably another speed rush through the last couple of chapters that we want to look at.